And we can use this to our advantage, this concept of referring to objects, because that means we can modify the contents of a list in a function. And I'm going to do the same function. I'm going to do the same function in two different ways. And we're going to use two ways, two different styles. They're both really important to know about because there's a reason that you may want to do one versus the other. And it's going to take a list as an argument. And I want to do is I want to increment every number in the list by 1. But I'm doing this in two different versions. So we'll call this incr mod, because we're going to modify the list passed in. So if I'm going to call this, I can't do it right now because it doesn't exist, but I'm going to pass in some list. And it's going to do something to that list. And I want it to change the values in place, meaning I want it to change. And remember, because it's a reference, the reference of the list is passed to the method, we can change the original. So for I in range, length of nums, and you have to use this version of the for loop to do this, by the way. You cannot use the other version for n in nums, because that n won't modify the list. It just gets you a readable value in the list. So nums bracket I equals nums I plus 1. That's all we're going to do. We're going to update the current value in this list by 1. Let's go ahead and save that. This is going to be, I don't have a good name for it. Let's do increment. You know, people think the hardest part of coding is remembering all the syntax. I think the hardest part of coding is figuring out good, meaningful names for things like files and function names. So let's actually make a list. Let's actually use our A list. A, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We have A. Now let's call it incr mod with A. And oh, it doesn't return anything. Why didn't it print anything? Well, there's no return statement. So this is a type of function that doesn't have a return statement. It just changed everything it needed to change and then ended. And so we actually have to print it out. And you notice that it did. 1, everything is up by 1. Why won't the other type of work for 4? So the other type of 4 is this. What is this changing? That's changing n. Well, what is n? N's a variable that has a value in it. Once it gets assigned this n, it's not going to update the list anymore. It's a separate variable. Whereas this is a reference to a list. Bracket I tells us to modify the value at that location. And so this right here won't change a single thing. It'll just change n, but n gets thrown away after every time it's used. So that doesn't actually work. Okay, so we can do incr mod again. And it went up again. And we can do incr mod again, and it went up again. So every time we call incr mod, whatever list we passed in gets modified, and it's going to increment every element of the list by 1. So let's do another version of the same. Let's do the second version. Instead of calling it incr new, though, I want to do a different way. So now I want to, instead of increment every element of the list, I'm going to modify the list that we pass in. Sorry, instead of modifying the list I pass in with every element, I'm going to return a new list. So this modified the existing list. Which is not. This new version, a new list. Don't change num. Sometimes you don't want to change the underlying list. And that's when you use this type of method. And there are different ways to do this. And we haven't covered all those ways right now, but for now, I'm just going to make a copy of nums by slicing it from 0 to n. So now I have a copy of nums and put it into the res list. And I'm going to return the res list when I'm done. For I in range, and again, len, but now instead of nums, I'm going to use res, but they're the same thing, at least right now. And then I'm just going to increment res I plus 1, which is the same code we had here, except instead of changing nums now, I'm changing res. And when I'm done, I need to return res, because this version makes a brand new list and then modifies that list. So we're going to take a new list, but leave the original list alone. But the new list is going to have all the elements of the old list, but incremented by 1 inside of it. So we can create a copy of nums. If you don't return res, you lose it. It only exists really inside of this thing here. So if you don't return it, you don't get it. You're better off, because then you can't actually return it into a variable. So if I just call this, I don't get to use it anymore unless I assign it to a variable. Unless I assign it to a reference. Now I actually get that list, which is unchanged. And that list has the new list in it. So A didn't get changed, but B did. If you don't return, it, oh, forgot to redo A. B doesn't have anything in it, so I can't use it that way. So you're better off returning it. Otherwise, you just lose it. Now we have two separate lists. One of them was incremented, one of them was not. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind, that when you operate on lists in a function, you can either create a copy of the list and then return it. And that's good if you don't want to destroy the original data. Or the other way is you modify the initial list, right? You loop through the initial list. It's just a reference. And this nums is actually referring to A. And so then we're changing it directly. We don't need to return anything because there's nothing to return. We could return nums, but it's really returning A again. I mean, we could return nums. And there's A, and then we could do incr mod of A, and it could return a value, see? But it's the same value. So we could return the same thing. It doesn't hurt to do it, but we don't need to do it because it changes the original. So you can do these two ways. You can either modify the original list, or you can make a new list and leave the original alone. And decide which version to use, you just have to ask yourself, is it necessary to keep the original list, or can you change it? And that's usually a decision that you make based on the problem you're trying to solve. Sometimes you want the original list, and sometimes you don't care, in which case you could just replace everything.